LNG subsidies have been an issue in Canada for a while, especially on the West Coast, where LNG Canada and Wood Fibre Canada, a couple of other little plants are very controversial. The governments have provided some subsidies, and that's become a bit of an issue in the BC election campaign. So we're going to talk to Julia Levin of Environmental Defence Canada. They did co-authored a study here not too long ago about LNG subsidies. So welcome to the interview, Julia.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start with an overview of your study. What subsidies did you identify? How much are they for? That sort of thing.
Last year, we co-authored a study looking at exactly subsidies to the fossil fuel sector in British Columbia, and we documented 830 million in subsidies to oil and gas and a small amount to coal, but the lion's share of that was to LNG. And since we published that study last year, Stand.Earth has come up with an update for this current year, and the number has risen to 1 billion.
Now, is that 1 billion per year or 1 billion in total?
That 1 billion was just for the year 2019-2020, so the year we're in right now. And as well as our 830 million, again, that is a yearly subsidy. And it's worth noting that when we do these inventories of fossil fuel subsidies, because of the lack of transparency, these are underestimates. So there's a whole variety of provincial tax exemptions, credits, which we just can't quantify because that information is not publicly available. So that's a grain of salt that it's worth noting when you hear these numbers, that they are underestimates, even though they're very high numbers.
Right. Now, I'm going to say something that is probably self-evident, but the oil and gas industry disputes your numbers. So let's talk about what they are and what makes them a subsidy as opposed to something else. So what's the biggest subsidy that you identified?
There's two that I'll just point out. The first is an agreement between the government of BC and LNG Canada. LNG Canada is this new LNG export facility, which is owned by Shell, Petronas, PetroChina, and a couple other players. And that it's a 20-year agreement, so it locks BC into a whole set of subsidies. And those are things like discounted electricity prices, exemptions from any increases to the carbon tax, breaks on corporate income tax. And it's been estimated that the total, not yearly, but the total sum of that agreement is around $5 billion. In another part of BC's subsidies is in the form of royalty credit programs. That's a large part of it, and royalty credit programs specifically for the LNG industry. So the largest program is the Deep Well Royalty Program, and that's risen to, this year it was $350 million. But companies are allowed to carry forward these credits in the case they don't want to claim it in the year that they're given. And so basically have been allowed to stockpile $3 billion in outstanding royalty credits that the companies can decide when they want to claim these deductions, which represents significant foregone revenue that the government is committing future governments to have to forego. Exactly.
Let's talk about LNG Canada for a bit. And so that's $5 billion over 20 years. And I know on the electrical side, they've decided to give LNG Canada the electrical rate, or e-drive rate, they call it. And I think it's under $40 a megawatt hour. I forget, it's like 37 or 39, something like that. And it's interesting because that power was supposed to come from Site C, which originally was supposed to be $69, $67 a megawatt hour. So already they're losing money. And now Site C is up around at least 100 because of the cost overruns. Have you taken that into account in making that calculation?
No, we've not the site overruns. The number that was used, it was the Center for Policy Alternatives that came up with the $5 billion figure. And they were using the current estimates for the electricity being provided by Site C based on the estimates so the number is set to increase as you stated. Site C has already run behind, and as it will continue to run behind because there's significant public and Indigenous opposition to the project, we can expect the cost of Site C to increase, but the government is locked in for 20 years to deliver electricity at a set price. So that subsidy will only increase over time. And
Well,
that's just one.
let me play devil's advocate here for a bit, because the government is subsidizing as part of its, both the provincial and the federal governments are involved in this. And both governments are subsidizing electric vehicle sales, all sorts of other climate policies. And the e-drive rate is meant to switch LNG Canada from using natural gas to drive its equipment to using electricity to drive it, and thereby avoid all those emissions. So how does giving LNG Canada a break differ from giving consumers a break on electric vehicles?
I mean, one of those options is aligned with what we need to do on climate change and to ensure a livable planet, and one of those things is not. I mean, subsidies that are aligned with reaching our climate commitments, whether at the provincial and federal level, are exactly what's needed. And these are fledgling industries. When we first started giving subsidies to oil and gas for the LNG industry, that was 20 years ago in BC, it was a different context. These were industries that didn't have all of the technology they needed, didn't have the capital they needed. The deep well royalty program that I mentioned, that was started in 2003 when fracking was just getting going. I mean, I would obviously be of the opinion that we shouldn't have done it then, but we certainly shouldn't be doing it now when these are established technologies. When you talk about some of the renewable sectors, those aren't established technologies. And it's important to put it into context. The BC subsidies are vastly outpace all of the province's spending on climate.
Gotcha. What are now the two that you mentioned are fairly, I think, well known. What are some of the lesser known or lesser well known subsidies that the oil and gas industry gets in BC, or LNG gets in BC?
Another example of some of those subsidies are just direct investments in different kinds of infrastructure. So the part of this comes from the federal government, part comes from the BC Hydro and the provincial government, but more efficient gas turbines is one of the things that were promised to LNG companies. There's also a memorandum of understanding that was signed between BC and the federal government last year, which promises $680 million, again, to electrification initiatives. So similar to what we were speaking about earlier, but a different pot of money that's not included in the LNG Canada agreement. And there's just a whole slew of provincial tax exemptions. I mean, there's at least 20 different measures. There's also things like cheaper construction costs and some of the money back on construction costs. And a part of it is recently, in terms of that transparency issue that I was discussing earlier, recently the Petroleum and Natural Gas Act was amended to limit the disclosure of royalty-related information. So this information isn't even accessible with free access information. So it's the transparency, it's the number of subsidies, it's that we can't quantify them. There's a lot of issues when it comes to subsidies.
Last question, Julie, and we'll kind of wrap up with this one. And that is, again, if I was playing devil's advocate, governments often subsidize these kind of industries because with the argument that they will increase the tax base and they'll get that much money back and more because they encourage that industry to expand or to relocate there. What's your response to that argument?
If we just stick on royalties, because that is the lion's share of BC subsidies regime, net royalties have been decreasing over the last 10 years. So in 2007, 2008, they were over $1 billion. But in the last few years, they've been closer to 152 million. So a fraction of the royalty credits that these companies are given. So if we just look at that regime, it's symbolic of the different, like how much more we are giving these profitable companies versus the public benefit through royalties, through different kinds of public revenue. We can't do the same analysis on some of the other tax initiatives, as I've said before, but that really shows the really generous approach when it comes to oil and gas, and we don't see that for renewable sector, for other clean tech sectors.
Great. Thank you very much for this, Julie. Really appreciate it. And no doubt LNG will be in the news again, and we'll be chatting again in the near future.
Thank you.